in that last video, we basically came up with this whole table right here. We figured out how to calculate this table. We figured out how to calculate this aggregate expenditures, and then we said that this aggregate expenditures was bringing in aspects such as planned consumption and this planned investment, things that we were bringing back from earlier in the chapter. And we also talked a little bit about that product market, and we said that in that product market, theoretically, that the national income should equal to that GDP. So we were able to figure out that the nation's product market is going to be in equilibrium where this aggregate output equals this aggregate expenditures, or where national income equals GDP. And we said that that is going to occur when these two columns are equal to each other. This aggregate expenditure is going to be equal to this output. So we could calculate it that way, like we did in the last video, or there's another way about going to finding the same information, and that's by the use of the Keynesian cross. And what the Keynesian cross does is it essentially takes this particular table, puts it into a graph down here. So what is a Keynesian cross? Well, the Keynesian cross contains only two lines. It contains the aggregate expenditures function. It also contains a ray that comes out at a 45-degree angle from the origin. So we can actually see that down here. We have this graph where it says this aggregate expenditures over here on the left-hand side, and we have this aggregate output on the bottom. And then we have this nice little red line. That red line is our aggregate expenditures line. Well, how did we come up with that line? What we did is we took this aggregate expenditures relationship and how it compares to this output, and all we did is we made a line with it. And we said that this aggregate expenditures, well, how did we calculate that? Well, if you remember back to the last video, we calculated it by using that aggregate expenditures function. This line, or this, what we said our line 1 was. So all this red line is this aggregate expenditures using the aggregate expenditures function that's equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending, and all we did was just graph it. And then we also put in this ray that comes out at a 45-degree angle from the origin. And we know it's at a 45-degree angle because we're finding out that the aggregate expenditures equals the aggregate output at all points. So you can see that right here, aggregate expenditure is at 2,500, and then also aggregate output is at 2,500 as well. Actually, I drew that backwards, but it still holds true with what I said. So right here, we find the aggregate expenditures is equal to 5,000, and that aggregate output is equal to 5,000 as well. If we come up here, we say the aggregate expenditure is equal to 7,500, and aggregate output is equal to 7,500 as well. So what is this ray doing? This 45-degree ray coming out of the origin, what is it doing? It's basically just showing us where aggregate demand equals aggregate output. And we know that the nation's product market is in equilibrium when the aggregate output equals this aggregate expenditures. So it's showing where this aggregate expenditures, not demand, but aggregate expenditures equals that aggregate output. So we're going to find at all that blue line, that 45-degree ray, shows all the different possibilities where this nation could be in equilibrium. But the nation is in equilibrium where that red line crosses that blue line, where that aggregate expenditures, that function, the aggregate expenditures function, crosses this 45-degree ray. That's going to show us where that nation, when that nation is truly in that equilibrium, that product market equilibrium. And frankly, that's going to be shown right here at 8,000 and 8,000. So graphically, we're seeing that that's occurring at 8,000. And also, if we look at our table, it's occurring at the same point. It's right at 8,000. All this graph is showing us is we are putting in the aggregate expenditures function, and we're showing up with a blue line. That blue line is at that 45-degree ray, where it's showing us where all the different possibilities, where aggregate expenditures equals aggregate output, showing us where all the different possibilities of where this nation could be in equilibrium of the product market, and it's where that aggregate expenditures crosses that 45-degree line, right at that point of where they intersect. That is going to be where the nation's equilibrium of product market occurs. We can now see it both graphically and on this table. So what does all this mean? What does it matter if the aggregate expenditures is greater than the output or vice versa? Well, what if we're below equilibrium? What if expenditures actually exceed output? So what we're finding is, what about on these first two lines? What does that really mean if we have these expenditures of $6,600 and an output of $6,000 where expenditures exceeds output? Well, guess what it does? People are spending more than what they're producing. As a nation, we are then spending more than what we're producing. So what does that do? If we are spending more than we're producing, it's drawing down on inventories. It's drawing down on leftover inventories, leftover products that might have been left over from, I don't know, it's just what it was stored from. So what does that do? Think about it this way. If you're a business and you had a bunch of surplus, you had a bunch of stuff that's basically being left over, and now people are starting to buy it. People are spending more than what they're on an aggregate across the whole nation. People are spending more than they're producing. Doesn't that tell you that if all of your inventories are beginning to be depleted, that you should start producing more? Well, as a nation, as a whole economy, if your inventories are beginning to fall, that's telling you as an economy that you need to begin to produce more. So guess what you do? If you are producing at 6,000, but as a result people were spending 6,600, you might start being willing to produce more because there's $600 left over here that could have been used to buy something. So guess what? You start producing more as a nation. So you increase output to say 7,000. Well, guess what? People are still buying more than what you're selling. There's still an additional $3,000 left over. Or sorry, $300 left over. So what does that indicate to you again? Your inventories are still being sold out. So that's telling you expand, make more. People are demanding more, make more. So then you expand again, and now guess what? You're at an output of 8,000 and you're selling it all out, but that's all that people want to buy. You are now at that point where you're in that national product equilibrium, where aggregate output equals aggregate expenditures, where GDP equals national income, where the amount that people are buying is equal to the amount that people are producing within a closed economy, as what our example is. But what if we get to become above equilibrium? What if we're spending more, or we're making more than what we're spending? What if we start producing $10,000 worth of goods, and we're not going to export any of these because we're making that assumption we're in that closed economy, but yet the government or the economy as a whole is only willing to spend $9,400. Well, what do you think that's going to do? Well, if they're only willing to spend $9,400, but yet you're producing $10,000 worth, that means that there's about $600 worth of products left over. It starts increasing these unsold inventories. So if you have a bunch of inventory left over, are you going to keep producing? Think about it this way. Think about a farmer. And a farmer hits a whole hay barn full of hay, and they go to start selling off that hay. Maybe they sell this hay, and they go to sell it throughout the year, and at the end of the year they still have hay left over in the barn. Do you think in the next year they're going to make just as much hay as they did the year before? Probably not. They've got leftover hay that's sitting in the barn they need to get rid of, so they don't produce as much. Well, that's the same thing that's going on in an economy. If you have these unsold inventories, that's encouraging you to produce less, to shrink. So then you shrink down to 9,000. And then because you still have unsold inventory of $300 worth, you revert back and you shrink again back to this equilibrium. So what you see is anytime that you are below equilibrium, where expenditures exceeds this output, you're going to be selling off these inventories, and it's going to encourage you to produce more. That's where that farmer sells all of his hay that year, and he damn sure wishes he had more, so he could sell more and earn more. So the next year he produces more hay. But whenever you get down here, where you're above equilibrium, where output increases or is greater than that expenditure, so where you got leftover hay in the barn, that farmer's not going to be producing near as much the next year.